Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not here because I'm a GI surgeon. I'm here because I edit a journal. I presume that's why the organizers want me to talk on this. Now, what is a good paper? I think in this audience, if you went around asking people what a good paper was, there'd be huge difference of opinion on what is a good paper. You've just seen an example of what people thought was landmark publications, while others felt they weren't so landmark. So, to my mind, a good paper would have good content, would have a structure, would be complete in all its parts, and provide a message to people who read that paper. And in today's day and age, it would be free of misconduct related to either authorship, plagiarism, a fraudulent publication, or a fabricated piece of data. I'll try and go over these as quickly as I can. Those of you who are interested in actually sitting through a workshop, we run workshops which last 2 days as well as 5 days, so you could spend time with us, trying to learn a bit more if you're interested. But before you start, you need to have something to say. If you don't have something to say, it's unlikely you'll end up with a good paper. So you have to ask yourself, do I have something to say? Is it worthwhile saying, and to whom is it worthwhile? So I need to have an audience, I need to have a group who would be interested in looking at the content of the paper and deciding that they would want to read through it. I also need to decide what would be the right format for such a paper. An original article, a brief report, maybe just a letter to an editor, and nothing else. So all these things would be important before I actually went on to write up what could be called a good paper. Now let's look at the structure of a paper, and most of us are familiar with the standard IMRAD structure of a paper. However, some of us get confused as to what goes within each part of this paper. It was none other than Sir Austin Bradford Hill, a statistician who worked with the Medical Research Council in the UK, who said, for each of these parts of a paper, we need to answer a particular question. So why did you start doing this study? Goes in the introduction section of a paper. What did you do goes into the method section of a paper. The results tell people what you found, and the discussion says, what does it all mean? Let me take you through all these parts very briefly. The introduction orients the reader to the pertinent literature to try and understand what you're going to say in the methods, in the results, and in the discussion section. So you define a lacuna or a lacunae knowledge. You provide the rationale for your study. You need to be brief, clear, and to the point. Most of this is written in the present tense, and you provide a few key references to support the information that you're providing in this section of a paper. Here's the introduction of a Nobel Prize winning paper, Watson and Crick's paper. The introduction was 2 lines. The paper itself ran into a few columns only. It wasn't more than a page. We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribonucleic acid. This structure has novel features which are of considerable biological importance. And then they went on to describe what they felt was the structure of DNA. So when you write an effective introduction, you need to provide the reader a very broad perspective of what is known. You then come down to a more focused perspective till you actually end up with the last line to say what the objectives of the study are. When I say globally, regionally, locally, and the issue at hand, this in very broad context doesn't mean globally from the global point of view, but from the global point of view of the topic that you're addressing. When we come to the method section, we need to tell people what all was done, how was it done, when was it done, and who did it. In addition to that, we also need to tell people how were the results analyzed, and if you had ethical clearance to do so, whether it was a human study or an animal study, in both situations you would need ethical clearance, and if it was a human study, then informed consent as well. The results tell people what you found, and that is often the easiest part to write because you've done the study, you knew exactly what you did, so that's not a difficult issue. The question is how to write this up, how to put this in the right places. And you use 3 methods to try and convey this information to people. You use the text, use the written text, you use tables, and you use figures to provide people this information. But the results should not include information which does not have the methods for which you've not listed out. It should not include any methods. The methods go into the method section. It's not unusual to find a bit of methods creeping into the results section. Interpretation of data is in the discussion section. What it all means is what you've got to say in the discussion section, not in the results section. We often get tempted to go ahead and explain to people what our results mean within the results section. We often duplicate information in tables, texts, and figures, and that's something that we need to avoid. And there's obviously no place for references in a results section, because references are used to get support from other people's work or to dispute other people's work. Your own work, you can't use other people's references. There are always doubts in people's minds whether you should use tables or figures. In written text, in written papers, in original research, always prefer tables. Whenever you have bars, histograms, and pie charts, they're very good to present in brief presentations, but they're not very good to use in written communication. Similarly, when should I put material into the text and when should I convert it into tables? If it's easier to understand a table because I have multiple variables, multiple rows, multiple columns, may be easier for a person to understand all that data in a table rather than write out paragraphs and paragraphs and get a person confused. Using statistical terms within the results section of a paper is something that needs to be done very carefully. All these words in the English language have very broad meanings. In the context of science, in the context of original research, they have very, very specific meanings. And I've given you examples here of only 4 commonly used terms. We need to be very careful when we go out and write these within the results, especially within the results section of a paper. You look at figures, there are a number of types of figures that one can make, but they are broadly two types. You either illustrate a concept or you make a comparison between groups of patients or groups of study groups that you used. But you don't make or prepare figures such as these, which can be misinterpreted. If you were to spend a minute to look at this, you would wonder what this is. And this is actually what it is. It's an inferior vena cavogram. And what was being shown to us was something which we couldn't probably figure out what it was. So we need to be careful when we draw figures. While we understand what those figures are, people who are reading our paper have no concept of what that could be, and therefore we need to label our figures as well. The discussion section of a paper is often very difficult to write, but what we need to tell people is what does it all mean. If you were to structure the discussion section of a paper, may become easier for us to write out this part of a paper. So this could be one possible structure of a discussion section of a paper. The initial part of the discussion could be a summary of the findings of your results, but without the actual quantitative numbers. This would tell people what you found. The second part could be what can be said about what you found. So you could make 1, 2, and rarely a third point about the results that you have obtained. Almost all studies, in fact I should say all studies, have a limitation. And therefore one must tell people what we cannot say from the results that we've obtained. And that's the third part of the structure of the discussion. And the last paragraph is the conclusions and recommendations to tell people what you make of it and how you suggest to them that they should go ahead and utilize this information that you have obtained over the study period that you've gone ahead and done the study. For each limitation, one must try and tell the reader what is the limitation, what is the consequence of that limitation, how you attempted to control or address the limitation, and how you interpret your data in view of that limitation. These are important to do, and it's unfair to expect that every reader is as big an expert or as well versed with the topic that you're writing about to be able to understand all the intricacies of the limitation section of your paper. Hence, you are best placed to try and tell people what is the true limitation of your paper. Conclusions, so what? I've done this study, this brilliant piece of work, so what? If nobody else is interested in this, who cares? So these are two questions that you need to answer at the end of your paper. You need to answer these questions, and only then and then alone can you have what most editors would think would be a good paper. So you provide people a take-home message which provides them something to remember that whole paper by. The paper must be complete. So this is the IMRAD structure, the introduction, method, results, and discussion are the heart of the paper, but they're not the complete paper. There are other parts to the paper which need to be addressed as well. There's a title, there are authors, there's an abstract, there are keywords, acknowledgements, and references. And due to paucity of time, I'm not going to talk about each one of these. But you do need to provide people a message which they can remember after they've read your paper. These messages need to be simple, and your paper needs to be simple. So you need to use simple words, short sentences, and short paragraphs. It was none other than Einstein who said, when you're out to describe the truth, and presumably when we do science, we're out to describe the truth, we leave the elegance to the tailor. So the language that we use should be precise, it should be familiar, it should be concise, and should represent a smooth and logical flow of thoughts. A good paper is good bedtime reading. It should allow you to understand the paper without having to focus and apply all your mind to whatever is being said within that paper. For those of you who are interested in good bedtime reading, here's a brilliant book. It's a small little book. You can download it from the internet. It's available free. Strunk and White's book on the elements of style. Tells you a lot about language and style, and is totally relevant to the context of writing a scientific paper as well. I come lastly to scientific misconduct, and this is something that's become an area of concern. It's always been an area of concern, but it's now been highlighted a bit more in the literature. And scientific misconduct is behavior or actions that do not conform to ethical standards. This could be either while you conduct research or when you publish research. Authorship is something that's always causing heartburn to people, and just like to spend a slide or two trying to tell you what this is all about. So if you're an author on a paper, you have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to publicly defend the paper. If you think you cannot defend a paper publicly, don't put your name on it. If you understand each and every part of that paper, you understand the intricacies of the paper, that's fine. If you don't, then it's better not to have your name on the paper. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors provided authorship criteria. They used to have 3 a few years ago, 2 years ago to be precise. They added a 4th one. And these all 4 criteria need to be met by a person who's on the authorship byline. So a person who's an author on a paper needs to have substantial contributions to either the conception and design of the paper, or acquisition of data, or analysis and interpretation of the data. So that's point 1. And there are 3 possible subheads within that point 1 which you could fulfill. But 2, 3, and 4 have to be fulfilled along with 1. And these are drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and all authors must take responsibility for any errors or omissions in the paper. So if you are an author on a paper and it turns out that you didn't understand much of the paper and the paper was found to be fraudulent, you can't say, I didn't understand much of the paper, I understood only 1 paragraph of the paper, the rest of it I don't understood. And my paragraph is fine, but the rest of the paragraphs are the problems. And that's not acceptable. If you're an author, you're equally responsible for all that goes within the paper. There are people who are ghost authors who write papers but are not listed as authors. This is common with industry-sponsored papers. And the problem here is that there is incorrect credit. So a person who writes up the paper is not listed as an author. But a person who is a big shot professor at an academic institution, a pharmaceutical industry or an industry person could go up to this person and say, look, we've written up this nice review article on this topic. Go through it. If you think this is good, you think we've covered everything fairly, you could put your name on it and send it for submission and publication. Why would the pharmaceutical industry want to do this? If they were to put the name of one of their medical writers or medical directors onto this paper and send it for submission, there is a huge conflict of interest. Instead, if they have an academician whose name is on this paper, then people who read the paper would think this academician is saying all this. And therefore, there is content attributed to a name who actually has nothing to do with the content of the paper. Even if you agree with it, even then it's incorrect for you to put your name on it. Then there are gift authors, authors who do no work, and you name them because you need to oblige them. In the Indian context, they are your immediate bosses, or sometimes a little further away from being the immediate boss. And sometimes you put in names of people because you feel that putting their name on may help your paper get accepted. After all, the editor is a human being. After all, the editor can be influenced. And if I put the name of a Nobel laureate on my paper, or maybe even mention the Nobel laureate in the acknowledgement section and say how he helped me write up that paper, and that help may have been a meeting at the airport, shaking hands, introducing yourself and giving that person a copy of your paper and nothing else, then that's incorrect. So there is incorrect credit here, and of course, if there is fraud, then the gift author says, I have no responsibility. There are other forms of misconduct, and here's a person who thought that publishing a complication of a central venous catheterization in 3 places was going to highlight this complication well. So he went ahead and finally got caught when he published the paper the 4th time around in the New England Journal of Medicine, and then had to have this retraction published. People plagiarize other people's work, copy other people's ideas, work, and publish them as their own, and then they get retracted. These papers get retracted. Or the instance here where there was suspected fabrication, alleged fabrication of data, not in 1 or 2 or 3 studies, but across a number of studies. And because the editors could not prove the allegations, they published something that was called an expression of concern. This is from an Indian scientist. Those of you who are interested can look it up. But these expressions of concern were published in 2 of the very well-known journals, the Lancet and the British Medical Journal. There have been issues of informed consent, and all of you would be aware of the RCC cancer trials in Trivandrum, where there were concerns with consent from patients. And there are issues of conflicts of interest. And what is a conflict of interest? The definition here is from the World Association of Medical Editors, which says that a conflict of interest exists when there is a divergence between an individual's private interests and his/her responsibilities to scientific publishing, such that a reasonable observer might wonder if the individual's judgment was motivated by those interests. I can say I was not influenced by those, but just the fact that there is a possibility that I may be influenced means there is a conflict of interest which I need to declare. Do all these research misconducts occur? Do they occur frequently enough? In 1974, a well-known immunologist, Summerlin, was going for an application for a renewal of his research grant. He'd done some studies where he wanted to transplant the skin of black mice onto white mice and show how the immunology of transplantation worked. His experiments hadn't succeeded. What he did was, sitting in his car, he had a photograph of a white mouse where he hadn't been able to transplant the black skin. He painted a black patch onto the mouse and presented this and got an extension of his grant, but he was caught out later on. There was controversy over the Nobel Prize won for the discovery of streptomycin, with the person who won the Nobel Prize PhD student saying this was actually all my work, the guide had nothing to do with it. All of us sitting in this audience would have heard the name of Eugene Brunwald, who is editor-in-chief of Principles of Internal Medicine, Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine. And he had a student working with him, or a fellow working with him, who published fraudulent paper after fraudulent paper along with Eugene Brunwald's name. Ultimately has over 100 retractions on PubMed. So if you were to search the name John Darcy, you'd find hundreds of retractions. David Baltimore, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Nobel laureate himself, had to step down from his position because there was an allegation of a lab which was functioning within his setup, which may have been conducting some fraudulent work. And more recently, we are aware of the breast cancer paper which the Lancet talked about, and the stem cell research from Korea. Those of you who are not aware, the anesthesiologists, and I'm sorry if there are a lot of them in the audience, we work with anesthetists all the time, but there were these three famous instances in more recent memory where large numbers of papers written up by individuals where no work or almost no work was done. Scott Rubin, an anesthesiologist, worked on pain medication. It was found he never did the studies. All these studies have now been withdrawn. Bolt did work on colloid research. 89 of his 102 studies, published papers, were found to be fraudulent. Fuji, who did a lot of work on postoperative nausea and vomiting, 212 of his 249 papers were investigated, and over 150 papers had fabricated data. So people do this. Why do they do it? Don't know. Publish or perish? But certainly you don't need 200 fabricated papers to publish or perish. Anyway, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors provides detailed guidance on how to write a paper. It provides detailed guidance on a number of other issues as well. But if you go to their website, there are a number of pieces of information that can be used very usefully related to manuscript preparation. And those of you who are interested could go and look up this website. There's something called reporting guidelines, and the most famous of these are the consort guidelines for reporting randomized controlled trials. There are guidelines for reporting different kinds of studies, and these go by very nice acronyms which can be remembered easily. But the place to look up guidelines to report work, including a case report, is at this site, which is equator-network.org, and gives you reporting guidelines on practically every kind of study: an observational study, a randomized study, a case control study, a cross-sectional study, a case report. They're all there, and you could go and look these up. It's in fact better to look up these guidelines at the time of designing your study rather than at the time of writing up your paper. Because if you haven't done some parts of what is required to be reported, then you obviously can't report that information at the end of the study. And if you were to unfortunately get stuck with something which was considered to be research misconduct, then you could go to this site, which is the site of an organization called the Committee on Publication Ethics, publicationethics.org. It's based in the UK, has over 5,000 journal editors as its members, and they keep coming out with guidance on how to deal with fraud and research misconduct. There are over 16 flowcharts there which are available to people to look up and read through to try and understand what's going on. So having said all that, once you've written up your paper, you've ensured there's no fraud, you've got good content, you've got a message, should you go ahead and send this for publication? No. Distance yourself. Ask a colleague to help. Let somebody else read your paper. Don't let the editor be the first and the peer reviewers be the second and third readers of your paper. Read your paper, ask somebody else to read your paper. Look at each word, sentence, and paragraph in meticulous detail. Look for consistency within sections. By now, you're bored. You're sick and tired of having written up the paper. Leave it or send it. Leave it. Leave it in a drawer if you've got a hard copy, leave it in to look at later folder on your desktop. And this is not my idea, this is the idea of a gentleman by the name of Stephen Locke, who was a very famous editor of the British Medical Journal. And he said that he used to put away these papers that he wrote for 3 to 4 weeks and then look at these papers after 3 to 4 weeks. And he would then wonder which fool had written this paper. And therefore, if we were to read our own papers often enough, we would find the errors that otherwise editors and peer reviewers pick up. Look at it again and then only send your paper for publication. So in summary, if you want to write up a good paper, you need to be precise, you need to be simple, you need to provide a uniformity across the different sections of a paper. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut to improving. The only shortcut is to write, rewrite, and rewrite. A good paper probably has good content, good structure, and is a complete paper with a good message. For those of you who are interested, we are hosting the World Association of Medical Editors meeting in Delhi, 2nd to 4th of October 2015. Along with that, there are pre-conference workshops which will be on peer reviewing as well as writing papers. So you may be interested in attending this. Thank you very much.